The interrogation room smelled like ionized oxygen and the lingering scent of my own bad decisions. It was a sterile white box designed to make a man feel like a microscopic slide under a very expensive microscope. My wrists were locked into the table by magnetic cuffs that hummed with a low, irritating frequency. "State your name for the record," the voice said. It came from a speaker hidden somewhere in the ceiling, sounding like a machine trying to pass as a disappointed parent. "Jackson Vance," I said, leaning back as much as the magnets would allow. "But you already know that. It's on the file, right next to the part where it says I have an unhealthy relationship with authority and a gift for ending up in the wrong quadrant at the wrong time. You are being held for a Class Alpha violation of interstellar protocol, Mr. Vance. You engaged in unsanctioned physical contact with a Level 1 sovereign. Do you realize that in some sectors, that's grounds for immediate vaporization?" I let out a dry laugh. My throat felt like I'd swallowed a handful of asteroid dust. Look, if I had a credit for every time someone threatened to vaporize me, I'd be retired on a beach on New Tahiti by now. I didn't know she was the Queen of Shadows. I just thought she looked like she was having a worse night than I was. Is being a decent human being a crime now? In the context of the Umbra kin, Mr. Vance, decency is a matter of biological warfare. You touched the High Sovereign Xylos. You breached her bioshield without a license. You danced with her. The way the voice said danced made it sound like I'd confessed to smuggling illegal antimatter. I closed my eyes and for a second, the white walls of the cell vanished. I was back in the ballroom of the Aurelian hub. I could feel the strange, cool pressure of her hand against mine. I could see the way the starlight from the Sapphire Eye Nebula bled through the crystalline walls, painting everything in shades of impossible violet. "It was just a waltz," I whispered. "A bit clumsy, maybe. I think I stepped on her toes twice. If that's a declaration of war, your politics are more screwed up than my flight records. We are not talking about choreography, Jackson. We are talking about the fact that you are still alive. No one touches an Umbra kin and keeps their sanity. They are hollows. They feed on the spark. Yet the scanners show your neural activity is not only intact, but glowing." I opened my eyes. The interrogator was silent for a moment. Through the one-way glass, I knew they were staring at the data. They were looking for a monster. But all they found was a man who had forgotten how to be afraid. "Let's start from the beginning," the voice commanded, its tone shifting from clinical to genuinely curious. "1 hour before the incident, how did a grease monkey like you even get past the security of the Grand Gala?" I sighed, the magnets on my wrists clicking as I shifted. "Fine. You want the story? It starts with a suit that cost more than my first ship and a drink that tasted like fermented regrets. 6 hours ago, I wasn't a prisoner. I was just a man in a very tight collar, trying to remember which fork to use for the Martian krill. The Aurelian hub was a masterpiece of arrogance. Built by the United Sol Systems as a gesture of unity, it was essentially a giant glass ball hanging in the middle of a radioactive nebula. It was the kind of place where people talked about synergy and interstellar peace while checking their hidden hollows for stock prices. I was there because Ambassador Thorne thought having a reformed smuggler on his staff gave him street credibility. His words, not mine. Personally, I think he just wanted someone he could blame if the appetizers went missing. The air was thick with the hum of 1,000 Cortex sync units. It's a weird sensation, like having a dozen tiny insects crawling behind your ears, translating the clicks, whistles, and roars of 40 different species into something resembling English. It's never perfect. Half the time, the alien metaphors for peace come across as, "We promise not to eat your children today." I was standing near the buffet, contemplating whether the blue liquid in the crystal decanter was booze or engine coolant when I saw her. She was standing by the Great Arch, a massive curve of reinforced glass that looked out into the heart of the nebula. While the rest of the room was a chaotic mess of color and noise, she was a pocket of absolute silence. Her phase fabric gown was the color of a dying star, deep charcoal with flickers of silver that pulsed in time with a rhythm I couldn't hear. The Umbra kin were legends in the fringe. The stories said they were the ghosts of a dead galaxy, beings who had traded their souls for immortality. They didn't breathe, they drifted. They didn't speak, they resonated. And most importantly, they didn't mingle. She was pale, her skin almost translucent, like fine porcelain held up to a candle. Her hair was a waterfall of ink that seemed to drift upward in the station's artificial grav well. But it was her eyes that caught me. They weren't the empty pits the propaganda vids showed. They were full of a deep, aching fatigue. It was the look of someone who had spent 1,000 years watching the same movie and was waiting for the credits to roll. "You're ghosting," I muttered to myself, using the old street slang for someone who's physically present but mentally a light year away. I should have walked the other way. I should have gone back to Thorne and pretended to listen to his speech about tariff-free trade. But I've always had a weakness for lost causes and lonely women. I adjusted my jacket, checked that my diplomatic ID was still pinned to my lapel, and started walking. Every step I took felt like I was crossing a minefield. The closer I got, the colder the air became. It wasn't the cold of a vacuum. It was the cold of deep water. A few delegates from the Centauri block noticed my trajectory. Their many-eyed faces twisted in what the Cortex sync translated as alarmed confusion. One of them actually dropped his glass. The sound of shattering crystal was lost in the algorithmic music, but the silence that followed it in my head was deafening. I reached her. Up close, she was even more striking. There was a faint scent of ozone and old parchment around her. She didn't turn to look at me, but the silver flickers in her dress began to pulse faster. "The view is better from the observation deck," I said, leaning against the railing next to her. "Less people trying to sell you things you don't need." She didn't move for 5 seconds. I thought maybe my translator had glitched and I'd accidentally insulted her ancestors. Then her head turned, slowly, gracefully. "You are speaking to me," she said. Her voice didn't come from her throat. It echoed directly in my mind, bypasses the cortex sync entirely. It was a beautiful, terrifying sound, like the hum of a warp core. "Guilty as charged," I said, offering a lopsided grin. "I'm Jax. I'm the guy they hire when they want to make the room look more diverse." "And you are?" "I am. Unintended," she replied, her dark eyes searching mine. "No one speaks to the shadow. It is not the protocol." "Well, I've always been a bit of a screw-up when it comes to protocol. Ask my CO. Or my parole officer. Actually, don't ask them. They talk for hours." A tiny, almost invisible flicker of something appeared at the corner of her mouth. It might have been a smile. "You do not fear the void?" "Sweetheart," I said, the slang slipping out before I could stop it. "I've spent 10 years flying crates through the shattered belt with no shields and a leaking oxygen tank. The void and I are old friends. And right now, the void is a lot more interesting than that ambassador over there talking about mining rights." I stood up straight and offered my hand. It was a reckless, stupid, wonderful impulse. "Would you like to dance? And before you say no, I should warn you. I'm moderately dangerous on a dance floor. I've been known to cause minor diplomatic incidents with my footwork." She stared at my hand like it was an artifact from a forgotten civilization. The ballroom seemed to freeze. The music hummed on, but the social gravity of the room had shifted entirely. "To dance," she whispered, "a physical manifestation of harmony. It has been 3 centuries since I was asked." "Then we're overdue," I said. "Let's give these ground pounders something to talk about." She didn't take my hand immediately. For a moment, she just hovered there, her feet barely touching the polished crystal floor. The atmosphere around us grew heavy, charged with a static that made the hair on my arms stand up. I felt a tingle in my skull, like a soft knock on a door I'd kept locked for a long time. Then her fingers brushed mine. The contact was like a jolt of pure electricity. Not the kind that burns, but the kind that wakes you up after a long sleep. Her skin was as cold as liquid nitrogen, yet there was a heat underneath it, a vibrant, thrumming energy that felt like a heartbeat. The ballroom didn't just go quiet, it became a vacuum. I could see Ambassador Thorne in the distance, his face turning a shade of purple that matched the nebula outside. His mouth was open, probably forming the words treason or suicide. Beside him, a pair of security droids hummed to life, their optical sensors flashing a warning red. "They are afraid," Xylo said, her voice echoing in my mind with a trace of sadness. "They think you are being consumed." "Let them think," I replied, gently leading her toward the center of the floor. I've been consumed by worse things than a beautiful woman, like debt and bad coffee. The music shifted. The algorithmic system of the Aurelian hub was designed to react to the collective mood of the room. Usually it played a bland, mathematical harmony that everyone could ignore, but now it sensed the tension. The rhythm slowed, deepened, and a low, cello-like vibration began to thrum through the floorboards. I placed my hand on the small of her back. The phase fabric of her dress felt like smoke. There, but not there. She placed her hand on my shoulder, and I felt a sudden, sharp intake of breath in my own lungs that wasn't mine. It was hers. We were sinking. I don't know the steps of your world, she whispered. Just follow my lead, I said, stepping into a traditional waltz. 3/4 time. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. It's like navigating a debris field. You just have to find the gaps between the rocks. We began to move. At first it was awkward. I was stiff, conscious of the hundreds of eyes boring into my back, and she was light, too light, as if she might float away if I let go. But as we turned, something changed. The cortex sync behind my ear suddenly hissed and died. The mechanical translation stopped, and yet I understood her better than anyone I'd ever met. I could feel her loneliness, a vast cold ocean that stretched across centuries. I could feel the weight of the crown she wasn't wearing, the burden of a people who were feared because they were misunderstood. You're not a hollow, I realized, the words slipping out as we spun past a group of horrified Martian delegates. You're just full of things no one wants to hear. She looked up at me, and for the first time her eyes truly focused. The silver flickers in her gown flared into a brilliant, blinding white. You see the light in the dark, Jackson Vance? Most only see the shadow it casts. I spent a lot of time in the dark, I said, finding my rhythm. You learn to appreciate the dimmest stars. We moved faster. The waltz became something more fluid, something that defied the station's artificial gravity. I felt my feet leave the floor for a split second as we turned, a true zero-G swing that wasn't in any manual. Around us, the other dancers had backed away, forming a wide circle of empty space. We were an island of motion in a sea of paralysis. This is a violation, a voice boomed over the music. It was the station's security chief, a man built like a cargo hauler with a temperament to match. He was stomping toward us, his hand on his stun baton. Release the sovereign immediately. Vance, you're ghosted. Drop her or we open fire. Xylos tensed. The silver in her dress turned to a sharp, jagged crimson. I could feel a wave of cold fury radiating from her, a power that could likely short-circuit every system on the station. Don't, I whispered, pulling her slightly closer. If you fight them, you're just the monster they want you to be. Just keep dancing. Trust me. She looked at the guards, then back at me. The crimson faded. She chose the dance. He is brave, she murmured, though I wasn't sure if she was talking to me or to herself. And very, very foolish. That's my brand, I joked, though my heart was hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. The security chief reached the edge of the circle. He raised his baton, the blue sparks of the stun field crackling. But before he could step forward, something happened that no one expected. Ambassador Thorne stepped in his way. The old politician looked terrified, but he was holding his ground. Wait! Look at the sensors. Everyone looked at the massive holographic displays that lined the ballroom. They usually showed the station's status, oxygen levels, power output, diplomatic rankings. But now they were displaying a neural map of the room. The weather of the Aurelian hub had changed. The clouds of anxiety, greed, and irritation that usually filled the station had been sucked away. In their place was a single golden pulse centered on the dance floor. It was a frequency of pure, unadulterated peace. I didn't know it then, but Xylos wasn't feeding on me. We were creating a feedback loop. My reckless sincerity was hitting her ancient, dormant empathy, and she was broadcasting that feeling back to the entire station. For the first time in 10,000 years, the Aurelian hub was actually unified. They're not fighting, someone whispered. It was a young intern from the Venusian delegation. They're happy. The security chief lowered his baton, looking confused. He looked at me, then at the Queen of Shadows, who was currently laughing. A soft, melodic sound that reminded me of wind chimes in a storm. The song began to wind down. We slowed our pace, the spinning world coming to a gradual halt. I stood there breathless, still holding her hand. My suit was rumpled, my heart was racing, and I was pretty sure I was going to be arrested in about 30 seconds. But as I looked at Xylos, I saw something that made it all worth it. The fatigue was gone from her eyes. In its place was a spark of defiance. "Thank you, Jackson Vance," she said, her voice echoing in my mind with the strength of a supernova. "For the dance, and for the reminder that even in a galaxy of protocols, one can still choose to be real." Then the doors burst open. A tactical squad in full phase armor stormed in, their rifles leveled at my head. "Get your hands up. Move away from the Sovereign. Now!" I looked at Xylos one last time. She squeezed my hand, a quick, cool pressure, before her courtiers materialized out of the shadows and pulled her away. She was Queen Xylos again, the distant, untouchable ruler of the Nyktos. And I was just Jackson Vance, a man who had just accidentally started a revolution with a three-step waltz. "Well," I said to the lead commando as he slammed me against the crystal wall and clamped the magnetic cuffs onto my wrists. "I hope someone got that on video. My footwork was actually pretty decent for once." The commando didn't laugh. He just hit the silent switch on my Cortex sync, plunging me into a world of muffled noise as they dragged me toward the brig. Back in the interrogation room, the voice from the ceiling was silent for a long time. "You're a madman, Vance," the voice finally said. "But the High Sovereign has just issued a formal decree. She refuses to sign the peace treaty unless you are appointed as her personal cultural attaché. Do you have any idea what that means?" I grinned, despite the aching in my wrists. "It means I should probably invest in some better dancing shoes, and maybe a book on how not to get assassinated by jealous vampires." "They aren't vampires, Jackson. They're worse." "Yeah," I said, leaning my head against the cold white wall. "That's what they say about everyone they don't understand." The magnetic cuffs didn't just snap open. They sighed, a sound of mechanical resignation that mirrored my own. I rubbed my wrists, feeling the lingering hum of the field in my bones. Standing over me was Ambassador Thorne, looking like he'd aged 20 years in the last 3 hours. His tailored suit was wrinkled, and his face was the color of curdled milk. "You really did it this time, Jax," he said, his voice a gravelly whisper. "I sent you to that party to be a placeholder, a warm body in a nice suit. I didn't ask you to spark a biological singularity with the most dangerous woman in the known universe." I stood up, my joints popping like small arms fire. "I didn't spark anything, Ambassador. I asked for a dance. If your grand peace treaty is so fragile that a three-quarter time waltz can shatter it, maybe the problem isn't me. Maybe the problem is that you're all terrified of shadows." Thorne didn't argue. He couldn't. He just pointed toward the door. 2 guards, fully geared up in heavy phase armor, stood waiting. They weren't from the station's security. They were Nyktos, Umbra kin warriors. They were tall, impossibly thin, and their armor seemed to drink the light from the hallway, leaving them as silhouettes against the sterile white of the brig. "The High Sovereign is waiting for you in the echoing grove," Thorne said, his eyes darting toward the silent guards. "She's made your presence a non-negotiable condition for the next phase of the talks. The Federation Council has approved your temporary promotion. You are now the official cultural attaché to the Nyktos delegation." I stared at him. "You're joking. You're throwing me to the wolves with a fancy title and a pat on the back? It's better than the airlock, Jackson. Or at least it's a slower way to die. Try not to embarrass the species." I followed the guards. They didn't walk so much as glide, their movements lacking the heavy clatter of human boots. We moved through the back corridors of the Aurelian hub, bypassing the main promenades where the rest of the diplomats were likely still whispering about the human who had touched a shadow. The echoing grove was a private botanical bay at the very top of the station, reserved for the highest-ranking guests. When the airlock cycled open, the temperature dropped 20 degrees. I stepped into a forest of crystalline trees that grew from pools of liquid mercury. The leaves were jagged shards of obsidian that chimed softly against one another in the artificial breeze, creating a sound that was half music, half warning. Xylos was there. She was standing at the edge of a silver pond, her back to me. She had changed her gown. Now she wore a simple robe of deep indigo that seemed to ripple like the surface of the water. "You may leave us," she said. The guards didn't hesitate. They vanished into the shadows of the crystalline trees with a speed that made my skin crawl. I was alone with a woman who could supposedly drain my mind like a battery. I took a breath, the cold air stinging my lungs. "I've had better job offers, Your Majesty. Usually they involve less risk of neurological collapse." She turned to look at me. The silver in her eyes seemed brighter here, reflected in the mercury pools. "Jackson Vance, do you know what my people call your kind?" I shook my head. Probably something involving short-lived or noisy. We call you the Flickers," she said, her voice echoing in my mind with a gentle resonance, like the flame of a candle in a gale, bright, warm, but so very easy to extinguish. "And yet, you walked into the darkness without a torch. Why?" I walked toward the edge of the pond, stopping a few feet away. "My mother used to say that people only hide in the dark when they're afraid of being judged. I saw you standing by that window, and you didn't look like a sovereign. You looked like someone who had spent 100 years waiting for someone to say hello. I figured, what's the worst that could happen?" "You could have been unmade," Xylo said, her expression unreadable. "The Umbrakin do not touch others, not because we are cruel, but because we are conduits. We feel the echo of every soul near us. For most, that echo is a scream of fear, of greed, of hidden hatred. To touch them is to drown in their filth." I looked at my hands. "And me? Was I a scream?" She moved closer, the cold radiance of her presence making me shiver. "No. You were a song, a messy, off-key, stubborn song about a man who refuses to believe he is as broken as the world tells him he is." I let out a breath I didn't know I was holding. "Look, I'm no saint. I've run contraband through 3 sectors and lied to more people than I can count. My reputation hit the hard deck years ago. The world sees the rust, Jackson." "I see the engine underneath," she said. "My people are being pushed to the edge of the galaxy. The Federation wants our technology, our energy siphons, but they want us to stay in the shadows. They see us as parasites. I need someone who isn't afraid to look past the void. I need a flicker who can stand in the storm." I leaned against one of the crystal trees, the cold surface biting into my shoulder. "So that's the deal. I play the bridge between the monsters and the men?" "If you accept," she said, tilting her head. I thought about the brig. I thought about the bored, terrified faces of the human diplomats. Then I looked at her, at the loneliness she tried so hard to hide behind her royal mask. "All right," I said, "but I'm warning you, I don't do your majesty very well. And I'm still a gearhead at heart. If I see a problem, I'm going to try to fix it, even if protocol says I should leave it alone." A genuine smile touched her lips, and for a second, the echoing grove felt warm. "I would expect nothing less, Jackson Vance. We leave for the Sanguine territories in 6 hours. Pack your things. The journey will be long, and the shadows there are much deeper than these." Leaving the Aurelian hub felt like escaping a burning building. One minute I was a prisoner in a white box, and the next I was being escorted onto a ship that defied every law of aeronautical engineering I'd ever learned. The ship was called the Star Eater's Silence. It wasn't built of hull plates and rivets. It looked like it had been grown from a single piece of volcanic glass. It was 300 meters of jagged edges and smooth curves, floating silently in the docking bay, while the human ships nearby were venting steam and humming with the roar of fusion cores. The silence was as still as a grave. The human delegation accompanied us to the airlock. Ambassador Thorne was there, flanked by 4 security guards who looked like they were ready to bug out at the first sign of trouble. They kept their hands near their holsters, their eyes tracking the Nikto servants who were loading supplies onto the ship. "Watch your back, Jax," Thorne whispered to me as we stood on the boarding ramp. "These people, they aren't like us. They don't have the same gears in their heads. One wrong word and you'll find yourself floating in the void without a breather." I adjusted the strap of my bag, looking at the guards. "You know, Thorne, you've spent 48 hours negotiating with them, and you still haven't looked one of them in the eye. Maybe that's why the talks are stalling." Thorne scoffed. "I'm a diplomat, not a martyr. Just do your job. Keep the queen happy and make sure she doesn't decide to turn the earth into a giant feeding ground. I turned away from him and walked into the ship. The interior was even stranger than the outside. There were no lights in the ceilings. Instead, the walls themselves glowed with a soft, bioluminescent pulse that shifted from blue to violet. There were no chairs, just recessed alcoves filled with a gel-like substance that adapted to your body's shape. Xylos was already on the bridge, or whatever the Nyktos called their command center. It was a circular room with a panoramic view of the stars. In the center, a group of 5 Umbra kin were standing in a circle, their hands linked. They weren't using consoles. They were the consoles. Their neural signatures were plugged directly into the ship's core. "We are ready to depart," Xylos said as I entered. I looked at the pilots. They were in a deep trance. Their eyes rolled back in their heads. Is that safe? I mean, I've seen some weird gearhead tech in my time, but using people as a navigation computer seems like a high-risk play. "They are not computers, Jackson," she said, walking toward me. "They are the ship. The silence is an extension of their collective will. It is a more intimate form of flight than your species understands." I took a seat in one of the alcoves, feeling the gel mold to my back. Intimate. Right. I'll just stick to my old-fashioned thrusters and manual overrides, thanks. The ship didn't lurch when we left the dock. There was no vibration of engines, no sudden surge of G-force. One moment we were looking at the docking bay of the Aurelian hub, and the next the station was a tiny speck in the distance. We were moving at a significant fraction of light speed, and I couldn't feel a thing. A few hours into the flight, I decided to explore. Ilos was busy with her advisors, so I wandered through the twisting corridors of the ship. It was a labyrinth of shadow and light. I eventually found myself in the lower decks, near the environmental systems. I saw a group of Nyktos workers, lower caste servants based on their simple gray robes. They were tending to a series of crystalline conduits that ran through the floor. Standing nearby was a human guard, one of the few the Federation had insisted on sending along as a security observer. His name was Miller, a guy with a buzz cut and a permanent scowl. He was shouting at one of the Nyktos workers. "I told you to move, you freak!" Miller barked, giving the worker a shove. The Nyktos stumbled, his thin frame nearly hitting one of the glowing conduits. The worker didn't fight back. He just lowered his head, his hands trembling. "Miller? Knock it off," I said, stepping into the room. The guard turned to me, his face turning red. "Look at this, Vance. This thing won't even talk to me. It just stands there and hums. It's creepy. They shouldn't be allowed on a ship with normal people." I walked over to the worker. He was young, his skin a pale shade of lavender. He looked terrified. "His name isn't It, Miller, and he's busy making sure the air you're breathing doesn't turn into poison. Maybe show a little respect." "Respect? For a parasite?" Miller spat on the floor. "I've seen the vids, Vance. I know what they do to people in the fringe. They suck you dry and leave you as a husk. I don't care what the Queen says. This whole species is a mistake." I looked at the worker, then back at Miller. "You know, I used to fly with a guy from the Outer Rim. He had 3 arms and smelled like rotting garbage. People hated him because of how he looked. But in the middle of a hard burn, when the engines were melting down, he was the only one who stayed to fix the leak. He died so we could live." Miller looked unimpressed. "So what? So I've learned that the real monsters aren't the ones with the pale skin or the weird eyes. The real monsters are the ones who decide someone is worthless before they even know their name. Now get back to your post before I tell the Queen you're trying to sabotage her life support." Miller muttered a curse under his breath and stomped out of the room. I turned to the worker, who was still standing there, his head bowed. "You okay?" I asked. The worker looked up at me. His eyes were wide, and for a second, I felt a faint, warm pulse in my mind. It was a feeling of gratitude, simple and pure. "Thank you." "Flicker," he whispered. I smiled, though it felt a bit forced. "Just call me Jackson, and don't mind Miller. He's got a gear loose in his head." I left the lower decks and headed back toward the bridge. As I walked, I realized that the ship felt different. The violet light seemed a bit brighter, the hum of the walls a bit more harmonious. Xylos was waiting for me at the entrance to the bridge. She had been watching the whole thing through the ship's sensors. "You defended a servant," she said, her voice soft. You risk the anger of your own kind for one of mine. I shrugged. Like I said, I don't like bullies, and I don't like people being judged for things they can't change. It's a waste of energy. She stepped closer, her silver eyes searching mine. Most humans would have ignored it. They would have seen it as a minor incident, a necessary friction between species. But you saw an injustice. I'm a simple guy, Xylos. I see a leak, I plug it. I see a guy getting kicked, I stop it. It's not about diplomacy, it's about not being a jerk. She reached out, and for a moment, I thought she was going to touch my face. She stopped just an inch away, her hand hovering in the air. I could feel the coolness of her skin, the magnetic pull of her soul. You are more than you think you are, Jackson Vance. The Federation chose you because they thought you were expendable. They thought a smuggler with no future wouldn't mind being lost in the dark. But they didn't realize that the dark is where the truth is hidden. We're approaching the first jump point, she continued, her tone returning to a more formal register. Once we enter the sanguine territories, there will be no turning back. The other sovereigns will not be as welcoming as I am. They will see you as a threat, a contaminant. I grinned, though my stomach was doing a slow roll. Well, I've never been good at blending in anyway. Let's go see what the rest of your family thinks of me. As the ship prepared for the jump into hyperspace, I looked out at the stars. They were blurring into long streaks of light, a million distant suns fading into the background. I was 3 million miles from Earth, on a ship full of shadows, heading toward a part of the galaxy where humans weren't even allowed to exist. I should have been terrified. I should have been looking for the nearest escape pod. But for the first time in years, I didn't feel like a screw-up. I didn't feel like a man running from his past. I felt like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. The Star Eater's silence shuddered once, a deep, resonant throb that felt like a heartbeat. And then we were gone, plunging into the deep violet void where the light of the Federation couldn't follow. It was time to see if a flicker could really survive in the heart of the storm. The transition out of hyperspace didn't feel like a jump. It felt like being squeezed through the eye of a needle by a giant, invisible hand. The violet void of the jump stream shattered, replaced by a darkness so profound it seemed to have physical weight. We had arrived in the sanguine territories, a sector of space that didn't just lack light, it seemed to actively repel it. In the center of that darkness sat Nix Eterna. It wasn't a planet, it was a Dyson shell, a hollow sphere of obsidian-like material constructed around a dying red dwarf star. The shell was hundreds of millions of kilometers in circumference, its surface etched with glowing lines of silver that looked like the veins of some titanic sleeping god. "Welcome to the heart of the shadows," Xylos said. She was standing at the edge of the bridge, her silhouette framed by the looming presence of the shell. I stood beside her, my hands gripping the railing. My brain was trying to process the scale of what I was seeing, but the math kept coming up short. How many people live in there? 6 billion Umbrakin, she replied, and another 4 billion from various client species. It is a refuge for those whom the galaxy has forgotten, or those who find the light of the Federation too blindingly judgmental. The Star Eater's silence glided toward a massive opening in the shell, a circular gate that looked like a dilated pupil. As we passed through, the internal space of Nix Eterna revealed itself. It was a world of floating islands and crystalline spires, all suspended in a perpetual twilight. The red dwarf at the center provided a dim, haunting glow that turned the atmosphere into a sea of bruised purple and deep crimson. We docked at the obsidian spire, the seat of the High Sovereigns. The moment I stepped off the ship, I felt the shift. On the Aurelian hub, the air had been sterile and clean. Here it was heavy with a strange, metallic tang. It felt thick, as if the air itself was saturated with a trillion unspoken memories. A group of high-ranking Nyctos was waiting for us on the landing platform. In the center was a man who made Xylos look like a ray of sunshine. He was taller than the others, his skin the color of old bone, and his robes were made of a heavy, velvet-like fabric that seemed to absorb all sound around him. This was Lord Malachor, the voice of the ancient blood. "You have returned, High Sovereign," Malachor said, his voice a low, vibrating rumble that made my teeth ache. "And you have brought a contaminant with you." His eyes, deep pits of absolute black, fixed on me. I felt a wave of nausea wash over me, a sudden, sharp pressure behind my eyes that felt like a drill. "He is not a contaminant, Malachor," Xylos said, her voice cutting through the pressure like a blade. "He is my chosen attaché. The Federation has sanctioned his presence. The Federation is a gathering of children playing with matches," Malachor spat. "They do not understand the burden we carry. To bring a flicker into this sacred space is an insult to the silence." I stepped forward, trying to keep my voice steady despite the fact that my heart was trying to kick its way out of my chest. "Look, Lord Malachor, I'm not here to start a fire. I'm just here to make sure the matches don't go off accidentally. I've been told I have a gift for that." Malachor's gaze narrowed. "A gift? You have the gift of noise, human. You are a cacophony of shallow desires and fleeting fears. You are a biological error." Xylos stepped between us. "That is enough. Jackson Vance is under my protection. Any move against him is a move against the crown." Malachor bowed, but it was a stiff, mocking gesture. "As you wish, Your Majesty. But do not forget, the great siphoning is tonight. We shall see how your flicker fares when the veil is lifted." Xylos didn't answer. She gestured for me to follow her as we moved into the spire. The interior was a forest of black marble and silver filigree. We moved through halls that echoed with the sound of distant singing, a haunting, wordless melody that seemed to come from the walls themselves. "What is the great siphoning?" I asked as we reached a private balcony overlooking the internal void of the shell. "It is our purpose, Jackson," she said, her voice heavy with a weariness I hadn't heard before. "You call us vampires. You think we steal life. But tonight, you will see what we truly take." She pointed down toward the base of the spire. A massive crowd had gathered there. Thousands of individuals from dozens of different species. Some were humans from the fringe colonies. Others were avian scree or reptilian-born. They all looked the same, broken, hollow-eyed, and shivering with a visible, soul-deep agony. "These are the grief-stricken," Xylos whispered. "They come from all over the galaxy. They are the victims of wars, of famines, of betrayals so deep that their own minds cannot process the trauma. In your world, they would be left to rot in hospitals or die in the streets. Their pain would fester until it turned into madness." I watched as a group of Nyktos moved among the crowd. They weren't using weapons. They were simply touching the refugees, their hands glowing with a soft, pale light. "We are the scavengers of the soul, Jackson. We don't eat blood. We eat miasma, the toxic buildup of emotional energy that occurs when a sentient being suffers more than they can bear. We take the pain into ourselves, we filter it through our own neural networks, and we neutralize it. We are the galaxy's kidney, cleaning the rot that your enlightened civilizations leave behind." I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. "You absorb their trauma? All of it?" "It is the only way they can survive," she said. "But the miasma is heavy. It is a poison. If we do not siphoning it regularly, it will consume us. Malachor believes that humans are the primary source of this poison. He believes that by allowing you here, I am inviting the very rot we fight to sit at our table." The ceremony began an hour later. I was forced to watch from a high gallery, flanked by Malachor's guards. Xylos stood in the center of the great hall, her robe discarded, leaving her in a simple white shift. A refugee was brought forward, a young woman, her face twisted in a silent scream. She was a colonist from a world that had been glassed by the Centauri during the last trade war. Her mind was a jagged mess of fire and loss. Xylos stepped toward her. She didn't bite. She didn't drain. She simply wrapped her arms around the woman and pulled her close. I watched through a pair of high-powered magnification lenses. For a moment, nothing happened. Then a dark, oily smoke began to seep out of the woman's skin. It was the miasma. It looked like liquid shadows, swirling with a life of its own. It flowed into Xylos, disappearing into her pores. The woman's face began to relax. The tension left her body, her eyes clearing for the first time in years. She let out a long, shuddering breath and collapsed into the arms of a Nyktos attendant, finally at peace. But Xylos was convulsing. Her skin turned a sickly, translucent gray, and her silver eyes flared with a terrifying dark energy. She fell to her knees, her hands clawing at the marble floor. She looked like she was drowning in a sea of invisible filth. "See the cost, human," Malakor's voice whispered in my ear. He had appeared behind me like a ghost. "She suffers the agonies of 1,000 worlds so that your kind can continue your petty squabbles. And you? You offer her a dance. You offer her a joke. You are a parasite on her mercy." I couldn't look away. I saw Xylos struggle to her feet, her body trembling with the effort of neutralizing the woman's grief. She looked ancient. She looked broken. My prejudice, the stories I'd heard about the vampire queens who fed on the weak, shattered into a million pieces. I hadn't been dancing with a monster. I'd been dancing with a woman who was slowly killing herself to keep the galaxy sane. And in that moment, I realized the true danger of the judgment I'd carried. It wasn't just that I was wrong. It was that my ignorance was an insult to the greatest act of sacrifice I'd ever seen. "I have to go to her," I said, turning to Malachor. "You will stay here," the Lord said, his hand clamping onto my shoulder with the strength of a hydraulic press. "The sovereign must endure the purge alone. To interfere is to invite the miasma into yourself. And a flicker like you would burn out in 10 seconds. I looked back at the hall. Xylos was reaching for the next refugee, her hands shaking, her face a mask of endurance. She looked up toward the gallery, and for a split second, our eyes met. Even through the dark fog of the miasma, I saw the same loneliness I'd seen on the Aurelian hub. She didn't want a protector. She didn't want a savior. She just wanted someone to know that she was tired. And I was the only one in the room who didn't look at her with reverence or fear. I was the only one who just looked at her as a person. "Let go of me, Malachor," I said, my voice dropping into the low, dangerous tone I used when a deal was going south and the blasters were about to come out. The Lord of Shadows laughed, a sound like dry leaves. "Or what? You will use your human humor to defeat me? You are nothing here. I'm the guy who invited her to dance when everyone else was too scared to move," I said, twisting out of his grip. "And if she's going to drown in that muck, she's not doing it while you stand here and lecture me on protocol." I didn't wait for his response. I vaulted over the railing of the gallery, dropping 20 feet down to the floor of the Great Hall. The landing hurt. I hit the marble with a thud that sent a jolt of pain through my ankles and up my spine, but the adrenaline was pumping too hard for me to care. I scrambled to my feet, ignoring the gasps from the Nyctos courtiers and the low, angry growls from the guards. "Jackson, get back!" Xylos's voice echoed in my head, but it was weak, distorted by the screams of the 1,000 souls she was currently processing. I didn't stop. I ran across the hall, dodging a Nyctos attendant who tried to grab my arm. I reached the circle of light where Xylos was standing. The air here was freezing, and the smell of ozone and old rot was so strong it made me want to gag. Xylos was holding a Vorn child now, a small, scaled creature that was leaking the oily miasma in thick, dark ribbons. The queen's skin was pulsing with black veins, and her breath was coming in ragged, wet gas. I didn't think. I just stepped into the circle and grabbed her shoulders. The moment I touched her, the world vanished. It wasn't like the dance. This wasn't a gentle sink. This was a flood. I felt a tidal wave of sorrow hit me. The smell of burning colonies, the sound of a child calling for a mother who wouldn't wake up. The cold, empty feeling of a life spent in a cage. It wasn't my pain, but it felt more real than anything I'd ever experienced. I felt my heart skip a beat, then another. My vision turned gray at the edges, and my lungs felt like they were filling with lead. "Let go, Jackson," she pleaded, her voice a faint whisper in the storm of my mind. "It will kill you." "No," I gritted out through clenched teeth. My knees buckled, but I held on. I didn't try to take the pain. I knew I couldn't. I wasn't built for that. Instead, I did the only thing a guy like me knows how to do. I thought about the worst jokes I knew. I thought about the time I tried to smuggle a crate of hyper-fermented Venusian cheese and ended up smelling like a dirty locker room for 3 weeks. I thought about the look on Thorne's face when I told him I'd accidentally insulted the Centauri ambassador's mother by complimenting her hat. I pushed those thoughts, those small, stupid, warm moments of human absurdity, into the connection. It was like throwing a bucket of cold water onto a grease fire. The miasma didn't vanish, but it recoiled. The dark energy in Xylos's veins settled, the blackness retreating from her eyes. For a second, the two of us were a small island of ridiculous, stubborn light in a sea of ancient grief. She let out a gasp and slumped against me. The Vorn child, now free of the worst of the trauma, crawled away into the arms of an attendant. The great hall was silent. Even the singing had stopped. I was shaking, my skin cold and clammy. My head felt like it had been put through a trash compactor. But I was still standing, and so was she. You idiot, she whispered, her head resting against my chest. You could have flatlined. Your neural paths aren't shielded for this. I'm a deckhead, Xylos, I said, my voice shaking. I'm used to working on live circuits. Just had to bypass the fuse. A hand grabbed the back of my neck and threw me away from her. I hit the floor and skidded several meters. Lord Malachor was standing over us, his face a mask of absolute fury. Blasphemy, he roared. You have tainted the holy purge with your filth. Guards, seize him. The Nyktos warriors moved in, their silver pikes humming with energy. I looked at Xylos, hoping she'd intervene, but she was still too weak, supported by two of her ladies-in-waiting. She looked at me with an expression of pure horror. Wait, she cried out, but her voice was drowned out by the sound of sirens. The obsidian spire shook. A deep, resonant boom echoed through the shell, followed by the screech of tearing metal. Above us, the crystalline ceiling of the great hall shattered, raining shards of glass down on the assembly. The skimmers, someone shouted. Through the hole in the ceiling, I saw them. They were small, needle-shaped ships, painted in the bright, aggressive colors of the Outer Rim syndicates. These weren't diplomats or refugees. These were scavengers, mercenaries who made their living by raiding the sanguine territories for Nyktos technology. They must have followed us from the Aurelian hub, I realized, or someone inside leaked the coordinates. The mercenaries began to drop from the ships on gravity lines. They were armed with heavy slug throwers and sonic disruptors. The Great Hall turned into a war zone in seconds. The refugees began to scream, running for the exits, while the Nyktos guards tried to form a defensive perimeter around Xylos. Protect the High Sovereign. Malachor ordered, but he wasn't looking at the mercenaries. He was looking at me. He drew a long curved blade from beneath his robes. The blade was made of the same obsidian as the shell, and it hummed with a dark, hungry light. In the chaos, no one would notice if the contaminant didn't make it out alive. I scrambled to my feet looking for a weapon. I found a discarded ceremonial staff, a heavy piece of silver wood, and gripped it like a club. Not today, Malachor, I said. I've got too many bad jokes left to tell. He lunged. He was fast, moving like a blur of shadow. I barely managed to parry the first strike, the vibration of the impact nearly numbing my arms. I swung the staff, catching him in the ribs, but it was like hitting a stone wall. Around us, the battle was raging. The mercenaries were targeting the crystalline conduits, trying to disable the spire's power grid. If they succeeded, the life support for 10 billion people would fail. Xylos, I shouted, dodging another sweep of Malachor's blade. The grid! They're going for the grid! She looked toward the conduits, her eyes widening. She tried to reach out with her mind, but the miasma she'd just absorbed was still making her unstable. She couldn't focus. I realized then that it wasn't just about surviving the night. The mercenaries weren't just here to steal tech. They were here to cause a collapse. They wanted to turn Nyx Eterna into a graveyard, providing enough grief and trauma to feed 1,000 generations of Nyktos, effectively turning the entire species into their slaves. I had to stop them, but Malachor was between me and the main terminal. You think you are a hero, human? Malachor hissed, his blade nicking my shoulder. You are a fly buzzing in the face of eternity. Your kind creates the mess, and then you expect us to clean it up. You do not belong here? Maybe I don't, I shouted, throwing the staff at his face. He swatted it away easily, but it gave me the second I needed. I lunged forward, not at him, but at the guard standing near the main power terminal. The guard was a mercenary, a massive, three-armed crawl with a heavy disruptor rifle. I tackled him, the weight of his armor nearly crushing my ribs. We tumbled across the floor, crashing into the terminal. I reached up, grabbing a handful of cables. I didn't know how Nyktos tech worked, but I knew how power flow worked. If I could create a feedback loop, I could short-circuit the mercenaries' skimmers. Vance, don't! Xylos's voice screamed in my head. If you touch the core, the feedback will kill you. I looked at her. She was standing 20 meters away, struggling against her own guards who were trying to pull her to safety. I looked at the thousands of refugees who were being gunned down by the mercenaries. I looked at the Vorn child I'd just helped to save. My whole life, I'd been a guy who looked out for number one. I'd run when things got hot. I'd lied when it was convenient. I'd lived my life thinking that being a flicker meant I didn't matter in the grand scheme of things. But as I held those glowing cables, I realized that the scale didn't matter. The only thing that mattered was what you did with the time you had. I'm a deckhead, Xylos, I whispered, though I knew she could hear me. And this circuit needs a ground. I shoved the cables together. A blinding flash of white light erupted from the terminal. I felt 1,000,000,000 volts of energy scream through my body, turning my blood to fire and my bones to ash. I heard the roar of the skimmers as their engines exploded, caught in the electromagnetic pulse. I heard Malakor's cry of rage. And then I heard nothing at all. I was falling into a different kind of darkness. Not the cold, lonely darkness of space, but something warm. Something that felt like the end of a long, tired dance. The last thing I felt was a hand grabbing mine. It was cool, soft, and familiar. Don't let go, she said. And for the first time in my life, I didn't. The universe did not end with a bang or a whimper. It ended with static. It was the sound of 1,000,000,000 old-fashioned radios screaming at once. A white noise that felt like sand rubbing against the inside of my skull. I was floating in a place that had no up or down, no left or right. There was only the gray, a vast and shimmering ocean of half-formed thoughts and shattered images. I was ghosting. Not the street version where you just check out of a conversation, but the real deal. My physical body was somewhere else, probably a mess of scorched meat on a cold marble floor, but my mind was caught in the architecture of the spire. The feedback loop I'd created hadn't just blown the mercs out of the sky. It had fused my neural pathways with the Nyctos core. Jackson. The voice was faint, a ripple in the gray. It wasn't Xylos, not yet. It was deeper, more ancient. I felt a pull, and suddenly the static coalesced into a vision. I wasn't in the spire anymore. I was standing on a world under a brilliant, healthy yellow sun. The sky was a piercing blue and the air smelled of salt and blooming flowers. I saw people, tall, elegant, with skin like bronze and eyes that held the light of the stars. They weren't hiding in shadows. They were laughing. They were healers. They were the original Nyctos, before the great cataclysm, before their star turned into a dying ember, and their bodies became conduits for the rot of the galaxy. I saw the change, a cosmic wave of radiation, a tear in the fabric of space that turned their sun into a monster. It didn't kill them. It changed their biology, making them sensitive to the emotional frequencies of others. They didn't choose to be vampires. They became the only things that could survive the psychic fallout of a dying system. And then I saw the first contact with other species. I saw the fear in the eyes of the first explorers who met them. They didn't see the tragedy. They only saw the pale skin and the way the Nyctos recoiled from the raw, unshielded emotions of the visitors. The explorers called them demons. They called them parasites. They built walls of protocol and prejudice, and the Nyctos, wounded and exhausted, eventually stopped trying to explain. They accepted the role of the monster because it was the only way to be left alone. You see it now, Flicker. The vision shifted. I was back in the gray, but Xylos was there now. She wasn't the queen. She was a girl, barely 50 years old, a toddler in her species terms, crying in a dark room because she could hear the grief of the entire city and didn't know how to turn it off. I felt her terror, her crushing sense of being a mistake. Xylos, I tried to say, but I didn't have a mouth. I pushed the feeling of a hand on a shoulder into the static. I'm here. I'm still grounded. Jackson, your mind is fraying, she whispered. The human brain isn't meant to hold the blood memory. You're leaking. If you don't come back now, you'll just be another ghost in the core. I felt a sudden, sharp pain. It was Malakor. He was outside in the real world, trying to purge the core. He wanted to wipe the human element out, to preserve the purity of their ancestral records. To him, my presence was a stain on a holy text. He's going to flatline me, I thought. He's going to kill the circuit. No, Xylos said, and I felt her strength surge. She was fighting him in the physical world and holding on to me in the neural one. Reach for the humor, Jackson. Find the absurdity. It's the only thing that miasma can't touch. I thought about the time I tried to explain the concept of a rubber duck to a Vulcan-like diplomat. I thought about the ridiculous, oversized hat Thorne wore to the winter solstice gala. I thought about my own face, covered in soot and looking like a startled raccoon after the terminal blew. The static began to pull away. The gray ocean receded, replaced by a blinding, painful light. I felt a sensation of falling, a stomach-flipping drop that ended with a scream of air into my lungs. I opened my eyes and immediately puked on a very expensive-looking rug. "Welcome back to the land of the living, Vance," a voice said. It was rough, familiar, and sounded like it was coming from the bottom of a well. I wiped my mouth and looked up. I was in a medical alcove, surrounded by humming crystals. Miller, the human guard I'd chewed out on the ship, was standing there, looking pale and shaken. Behind him, Xylos was slumped in a chair, her skin almost translucent, her eyes closed. Where's the choir?" I croaked. My throat felt like I'd been gargling broken glass. "The mercs are either dead or in the brig," Miller said, stepping forward to offer me a cup of water. "You saved the station, kid. I don't know how you did it, but the EMP you triggered fried their ships and their gear. We just had to mop up the stragglers." I took the water, my hands shaking so badly I spilled half of it. "And the Queen?" "She's exhausted," Miller whispered. "She wouldn't let them move her until you woke up. She's been holding your hand for 6 hours, talking to you in a language I've never heard." I looked at Xylos. Her hand was still resting on the edge of my bed, her fingers twitching. Even in her sleep, she looked like she was fighting a war. I looked at Miller. "You didn't bug out." Miller looked at the floor. "I wanted to. When the ceiling came down, I thought we were all KIM. But then I saw you grab those cables. I figured if a deckhead like you could stand his ground, I couldn't exactly run for the pods." He looked back at me, and for the first time, I didn't see the prejudice in his eyes. I saw a grudging, painful respect. "I'm sorry about what I said on the ship, Vance. I was a jerk. I didn't know what they were. I still don't, really. But I saw what she did for those people in the hall." I leaned back against the gel pod, closing my eyes. "None of us do, Miller. We're all just guessing in the dark." The doors to the medical bay hissed open. Lord Malachor entered, followed by a phalanx of guards. He looked like he'd been through a blender, his robes torn and his face marked by the feedback. But his eyes were still full of that cold obsidian fire. "The council is convening," he said, ignoring Miller and looking directly at me. "They want to discuss the future of Earth's diplomatic standing, and they want to decide what to do with the human who knows our secrets." I stood up, my legs feeling like overcooked noodles. "Well, don't keep them waiting. I've got a few things I'd like to say to the council myself." The council chamber of Nix Eterna was a cathedral of silence. 12 high sovereigns sat in a semicircle of obsidian thrones, their faces hidden behind masks of hammered silver. The only light came from the red dwarf star pulsing at the center of the shell, casting long, bloody shadows across the floor. I stood in the center of the room, feeling small and very, very human. My shoulder was bandaged, and every muscle in my body felt like it had been tenderized with a hammer, but I kept my head up. Beside me stood Xylos. She was back in her royal robes, her face a mask of cold, regal indifference. But I could feel the tremor in her hand where it was hidden in her sleeve. "The charge is contamination," a sovereign said, her voice echoing through the chamber like a funeral bell. "Jackson Vance, you have accessed the blood memory of the Nyctos. You have looked into the sacred records of our species without the required 3 centuries of spiritual preparation." I stepped forward, the sound of my boots on the marble sounding like a thunderclap. "With all due respect, I didn't access anything. I was shoved into it by a power surge while I was trying to stop a bunch of mercs from turning this place into a buffet. If you're looking for someone to blame, try the guys who leaked the coordinates of the spire. Malachor, who was seated at the far end of the circle, leaned forward. The leak is being investigated, but your presence here is a separate issue. You have seen our origins. You have seen our weakness. You could return to your federation and tell them that the monsters they fear are just a broken people clinging to a dying star. You could strip us of our only defense, our reputation. Xylos spoke then, her voice clear and resonant. And what has that reputation bought us, Malachor? 1,000 years of isolation? A galaxy that treats us like a disease to be managed? We have spent centuries hiding our truth because we were afraid of being judged. And yet, here is a man who saw the worst we have to offer, who felt the miasma in his own soul, and his first instinct wasn't to run, it was to help. The council murmured, a sound like dry wind through autumn leaves. He is a flicker, another sovereign shouted. His life is a heartbeat in the span of our history. He cannot understand the weight of the grief we carry. He will forget. He will move on to the next crisis, the next party, the next deal. I looked at the silver mass. You're right, I am a flicker. I've only got 70, maybe 80 years if I'm lucky, and I stopped jumping into live circuits. To you, I'm a blink of an eye. But you know what's great about being a flicker? We don't have the luxury of waiting 3 centuries to do the right thing. We have to do it now, or we miss our chance. I walked toward the center of the circle, ignoring the guards who stepped forward to block my path. You talk about the weight of your grief like it's a badge of honor, but it's not. It's a prison. You've convinced yourselves that no one can understand you, so you don't even try to speak. You feed on the pain of others because it's the only way you can feel connected to a galaxy that hates you. Malachor's eyes flared. You know nothing of our connection. I know what I felt in that static, I shouted back. I felt your loneliness. I felt the moment you decided that it was easier to be feared than to be pitied. And I'm telling you, as a guy who spent his whole life being judged for being a smuggler and a screw-up, that you're wrong. I stopped a few feet from Malachor's throne. You aren't monsters. You're just people who got a raw deal from the universe. And the only thing keeping you in the dark isn't the Federation or the Mercs. It's your own belief that you don't deserve anything better. The silence that followed was heavy enough to crush a ship. I could see the other sovereigns looking at each other, their silver masks reflecting the red light of the star. Silo stood perfectly still, her gaze fixed on me. And what would you have us do, Flicker? The first sovereign asked. Should we open our gates? Should we invite the Federation to come and study us like lab rats? No, I said, softening my voice. Just stop hiding. Stop pretending that you're above the rest of the galaxy because you can handle their pain. You need the light as much as we need the shadow. The Federation is scared of you because they don't know what you do. They see the miasma being drained and they think you're stealing their souls. Tell them the truth. Show them that you're the ones keeping their civilizations from drowning in their own filth. It is a risk, Malachor whispered. If they know we are vulnerable, they will come with more than just mercenaries. They will come with scientists and soldiers. They will try to cure us. Maybe, I said. Some will, but some won't. Some, like Miller or that kid I helped in the lower decks, will see that you're just trying to survive. And maybe, just maybe, you'll find that you don't have to carry the grief alone anymore. Xylos stepped forward and knelt in the center of the chamber, a shocking move for a high sovereign. I am the one who brought him here. I am the one who allowed the sink. If there is a price for this breach of protocol, I will pay it. But I will not let this man be punished for being the only person in 5 sectors who had the guts to look me in the eye and see a woman instead of a ghost. The council began to speak in a low, melodic language that my brain couldn't process. They talked for what felt like hours, their voices rising and falling in complex harmonies. I stood there, my legs aching, my mind racing. I was a long way from the Aurelian hub. I was a long way from the life I'd known. Finally, the first sovereign stood up. Jackson Vance, she said, your actions in the Spire saved countless lives. Your breach of the blood memory is a crime, but your defense of the High Sovereign is a service that cannot be ignored. We will not execute you. We will not exile you. I felt a wave of relief so strong I nearly tripped. However, she continued, her voice hardening, we cannot allow you to return to the Federation. Not yet. You carry the resonance of the Nyctos in your mind. Until that resonance fades, you are a part of us. You will remain in Nix Eterna as the liaison of the silent threshold. You will be the voice that speaks to the Federation on our behalf, and you will be the one who teaches us how to be flickers. I looked at Xylos. She was standing up, a look of shocked delight on her face. Then I looked at Malachor. He didn't look happy, but he didn't look like he was going to kill me anymore. He looked like a man who had just realized his favorite book was missing its final chapter. Liaison of the silent threshold, I repeated. Does that come with a dental plan? Because I'm pretty sure I cracked a tooth during that EMP. The sovereign tilted her silver mask, and for a second I could swear I heard a soft, melodic laugh. You are a strange creature, Jackson Vance. But perhaps strangeness is what we need to bridge the gap. As we walked out of the chamber, the heavy obsidian doors closing behind us, Xylos grabbed my arm. Her touch was still cool, but the vibrating energy beneath it felt different now. Less like a storm, more like a steady, glowing coal. You did it, she whispered. You challenged the foundation of our entire society and walked out alive. I've seen diplomats spend 50 years trying to change a single line of the code, and you did it with a lecture on rubber ducks and bad jokes. I grinned, though my whole face ached. Like I said, Xylos, we flickers don't have time for the long game. We have to make every second count. We walked to the balcony overlooking the internal void of the shell. The red dwarf was pulsing, its light catching the silver veins of the Dyson shell. It was a beautiful, haunted, impossible place, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't looking for the exit. So, I said, looking out at the floating islands, what's the first lesson for a bunch of ancient vampires who want to learn how to be human? Xylos leaned against the railing, her shoulder touching mine. I suspect it starts with another dance. I laughed, the sound echoing through the twilight of the spire. Well, I hope you're ready, because I'm still a terrible lead. She looked at me, and in the dim light, her silver eyes were full of a hope that was no longer disguised as solitude. I think I can manage the risk. I looked down at the streets of the city below. I could see the refugees being moved into comfortable quarters, the Nyctos attendants treating them with a new kind of gentleness. I could see the change beginning, a slow, painful, beautiful transformation. I was a long way from Earth. I was a long way from the man who used to run from his problems. But as I stood there in the heart of the shadow, I realized that I hadn't lost anything. I just found a bigger room to dance in. The arrival of the Federation ship, the SS Aurora, was heralded by a series of high-frequency pings that echoed through the crystalline corridors of the obsidian spire. It had been precisely 14 days since I had nearly turned my brain into a grilled cheese sandwich by grounding the station's power grid. 2 weeks of recovery, 2 weeks of politics, and 2 weeks of watching Xylos navigate the wreckage of her people's isolation. I stood on the primary observation deck, adjusted the high-collared tunic that marked me as the liaison of the silent threshold. It was made of a heavy midnight blue silk that didn't itch as much as I expected, though the silver embroidery of a stylized candle flame on the lapel felt a bit on the nose. They're coming in hot, I muttered, watching the white and gold hull of the Aurora drift toward the docking pupil of Nix Eterna. The pilot is nervous. He's overcorrecting on the lateral thrusters. Xylos stood beside me, her presence a cool, grounding hum in the back of my mind. The neural resonance hadn't faded yet. It probably never would. We were locked in a frequency that felt like a permanent soft-focus lens on the world. Can you blame them? She asked, her voice reflecting a mix of amusement and lingering sorrow. To them, this shell is a tomb. They expect to be drained the moment the airlocks cycle. Then we'd better make sure the welcome wagon doesn't look like a funeral procession, I said. I checked my internal clock. It was 10 in the morning. Station time. We had spent 3 hours prepping the greeting party. I'd insisted on a few changes to the standard Nyctos protocol. No silver masks, no silent hovering, and for the love of the stars, no chanting in the ancient tongue. It tended to make ground pounders think they were about to be sacrificed to a dark god. Ambassador Thorne was the first to step off the ramp. He looked like a man walking toward his own execution, his face a pale shade of gray that almost matched the Nyctos courtiers. He was flanked by 6 security officers in full tactical gear, their rifles held at a low-ready position. "Thorn," I said, stepping forward with my best lopsided grin. "You're late. I almost started the party without you." The ambassador stopped, his eyes darting from me to Xylos, then to the massive, glowing architecture of the spire. "Vance, you're still in one piece." "Mostly," I said, patting my chest. "A few scorched circuits and a cracked tooth, but I've had worse weekends." "Welcome to Nix Eterna. Try not to touch the mercury pools. They're hell on the shoes." Thorn didn't move. He was staring at Xylos. "High Sovereign," he said, his voice cracking slightly. "We received your unusual request. The Federation Council is concerned about the security of our representatives." Xylos stepped forward, her movements fluid and graceful. "Your security is guaranteed by the blood memory of my people, Ambassador. But if you prefer the word of a human, perhaps you should listen to Mr. Vance. He has seen the heart of our shadow and chose to remain." Thorn looked at me, his eyes full of a frantic, unspoken question. "Is it true, Jax? Are they really cleaning the miasma?" I nodded, the humor fading from my face. "They're the ones taking the hits for us, Thorn. Every war we start, every colonist who gets traumatized by a pirate raid, the Nyctos pick up the bill. They don't eat us. They save us from ourselves. And we've been calling them monsters for 1,000 years because it was easier than saying thank you." Thorn looked around the docking bay. He saw Miller, the human guard, standing next to a Nyctos worker. They were sharing a flask of something that looked like coffee. He saw the refugees, now clean and fed, resting in the alcoves. The prejudice in his eyes didn't vanish. It was too deep for that, but it cracked. A little bit of light started to leak through. "I'll need to see the records," Thorn said, trying to regain his professional footing. "The council will want hard data on the emotional siphoning process." "You'll get it," I promised. "But first we're going to have lunch. And no, you're not on the menu." The next few days were a blur of diplomatic friction and slow-motion revelations. I spent my time acting as a human-to-shadow translator, and I don't mean just the language. I had to explain why the Nyctos moved so slowly. It was to avoid overwhelming their sensors with the kinetic energy of others. And why they preferred dim lighting. It was easier on their translucent skin. In return, I had to explain to the Nyctos why the humans were so loud and why they kept asking about vampire myths. "It's a cultural thing," I explained to Lord Malachor during a particularly tense meeting about trade routes. "We use stories to process our fears. We made you the villains because we didn't have a category for telepathic emotional filters. It's not personal, it's just how we categorize the unknown." Malachor, who was still adjusting to the idea of not executing me, looked unimpressed. "Your species categorizes by destruction, Flicker. You fear what you cannot control, and you destroy what you fear." "Usually," I admitted, "but sometimes we just dance with it." One of the most surprising moments came during the third evening. A group of human scientists had been invited to observe a minor purification ceremony. I was worried they'd freak out when the miasma started to flow, but instead one of the researchers, a woman named Dr. Aries, started to cry. She wasn't crying from fear. She was watching a Nyctos youth take the grief from an elderly man who had lost his family in a shuttle crash. "It's beautiful," she whispered, her hand trembling as she took notes. "We've been trying to treat trauma with chemicals and talk therapy for centuries. We never realized that it was a physical weight that could be lifted. We've been so blind. That was the turning point. Once the scientists saw the utility of the Nyctos, the politicians followed. It's a sad truth of my species. We're much more likely to accept someone once we realize they can do something for us. But hey, I'll take a selfish peace over a righteous war any day." As the week drew to a close, the tension in the station had shifted from existential dread to a kind of cautious curiosity. You'd see humans and Nyctos sitting together in the commons, using their Cortex sync units to debate the merits of various musical styles. The Nyctos liked jazz. They found the improvisational nature of it to be a fascinating reflection of the human soul. I was sitting in a small cafe near the residential district, drinking a cup of real earth-grown tea that Thorn had brought as a peace offering. Miller sat across from me, looking more relaxed than I'd ever seen him. "So, Jax," he said, leaning back in his chair, "you really staying?" Thorne says the Federation is going to make this a permanent outpost. They want you to head the whole show. I took a sip of the tea, the warmth spreading through my chest. Yeah, I think I am. I've spent my whole life jumping from one system to the next, trying to find a place where I didn't feel like a cog in a broken machine. I think I found it. It's a hell of a view, Miller agreed, looking out at the red dwarf star pulsing in the center of the shell. And the pay is better than guarding a freighter. He looked at me, his expression turning serious. You know, when we were on the ship, I really thought you were a dead man walking. I figured you were just another guy who'd gotten in over his head. I was, I said, but it turns out being in over your head is the only way to learn how to swim. We finished our tea in silence, watching the people of two very different worlds try to figure out how to live in the same house. It wasn't perfect. There were still plenty of people on both sides who looked at each other with suspicion. There were still rumors of syndicate remnants looking for revenge. There was still a lot of work to do, but the silence wasn't quite so heavy anymore. It felt like the air before a storm has passed, clean, charged, and full of the possibility of a new day. I stood up, dusting the crumbs from my tunic. Well, I'd better get to the bridge. The High Sovereign wants to discuss the new educational exchange program. Apparently, she wants to send a group of Niktos students to Earth to study theater. Miller laughed. Theater? They're going to have a field day with Shakespeare. I grinned. I just want to see the look on a drama teacher's face when a student actually feels the ghost of Hamlet's father. As I walked toward the spire, I realized that I wasn't running anymore. For the first time in 32 years, I knew exactly who I was and where I was going. I was Jackson Vance, the guy who asked a queen to dance, and I was just getting started. The final signing of the Concord of Shadows took place at 6 in the evening on the 100th floor of the Obsidian Spire. It wasn't the massive grand event that the Aurelian Hub Gala had been. There were no bioluminescent walls shifting to reflect the crowd's mood, and no algorithmic music designed to be mathematically inoffensive. Instead, the room was lit by simple, warm light spheres. There were about 50 people in attendance, representatives from the Federation, the Niktos Council, and a few delegates from the fringe worlds who had been the first to benefit from the new alliance. I stood at the back of the room, watching Xylos as she signed the digital parchment. She looked different than the woman I had met 3 weeks ago. She was still elegant, still commanding, but the cold, distant mask was gone. She looked present. When the last signature was recorded, a soft cheer went up from the human side of the room. The Niktos didn't cheer, but the silver veins in the walls pulsed with a warm, golden light, a collective sigh of relief that felt like a gentle breeze against my skin. Malachor approached me afterward. He wasn't wearing his silver mask. His face was weathered, his skin like old parchment, but his eyes were no longer pits of black fire. Liaison, he said, inclined his head in a gesture that was almost, but not quite, a bow. Lord Malachor, I replied, you look like you've lost a few light years of stress. He let out a short, dry sound that might have been a chuckle. The burden is shared now. It is lighter. The Federation has agreed to send volunteer empaths to assist in the filtering process. It turns out your species has its own version of our gift, though it is untrained and chaotic. We call them artists and nurses, I said. I think they'll fit in just fine. Malachor looked at me for a long moment. You have done a strange thing here, Jackson Vance. You have forced us to look at the sun, and you have forced the sun to look at us. I still think you are a noisy, reckless flicker. I grinned, and I still think you're a grumpy old ghost. But we make it work, don't we? We do, he admitted, before turning to join the other sovereigns. I slipped out of the room, heading toward my favorite spot on the observation deck. I needed a moment of quiet. The transition from a smuggler on the run to a high-ranking diplomat was still making my head spin. I stood by the glass looking out at the red dwarf. In the 2 weeks since the battle, my life had changed in ways I couldn't have imagined. I wasn't just Jackson Vance, the screw-up. I was the man who had bridged the gap between two civilizations. I had a staff, an office, and a mission that actually mattered. But more than that, I had changed inside. The prejudice I'd carried, the fear of anything that wasn't human, the assumption that everyone was out for themselves, was gone. I'd seen the absolute best of an alien species, and I'd seen the absolute worst of my own. I'd realized that the only real difference between a hero and a monster is whether they're willing to take the hit for someone else. Xylos found me there, as I knew she would. She didn't say anything at first, just stood beside me, our shoulders touching. The neural sync was quiet tonight, a steady, rhythmic pulse that felt like a warm hearth. "It's done," she said softly. "The isolation is officially over." I nodded. Now comes the hard part. Learning how to actually talk to each other without a 300-meter glass shell in the way. She turned to me, her silver eyes reflecting the dim light of the star. "Are you happy, Jackson?" I looked at her, and for the first time in my life, I didn't have a sarcastic comeback ready. "I'm better than happy," I said. "I'm home." I reached out and took her hand. It was still cool like polished marble, but it didn't feel like a biological threat anymore. It felt like a partner's hand. I looked back at the last few months. I thought about the Aurelian hub, the dance, the interrogation room, the battle in the spire. It felt like a lifetime ago. I thought about the man I used to be, the guy who would have seen the Nyctos and immediately started looking for a way to exploit them or run from them. I realized then that prejudice isn't just about hating someone else. It's a way of protecting yourself from the vulnerability of empathy. If you decide someone is a monster, you don't have to care if they're hurting. You don't have to feel the weight of their sacrifice. You can just walk away and feel superior. But walking away is the easy part. Staying is where the real work happens. I looked at the stars beyond the shell. They seemed brighter now, less like distant, cold fires, and more like a map of places we still had to go. Reflection and passage. I spent 32 years thinking that the galaxy was a cold, empty place where the only way to survive was to keep your head down and your shields up. I live by a simple code. Don't get involved, don't ask questions, and never ever trust anyone who doesn't look like you. I thought my humor was a weapon, a way to keep people at a distance so they couldn't see how much I was struggling just to stay afloat. But standing here on the edge of a world made of shadows, I realized how much I missed by being so careful. I was so busy judging the Nyctos for what they were that I never bothered to see what they did. I saw a threat where there was a sanctuary. I saw a cage where there was a cradle. It's funny, isn't it? We travel thousands of light years across the void, building faster ships and smarter computers, but we still haven't figured out how to look at a stranger without reaching for a label. We spend so much time building walls to keep out the monsters that we don't realize we're just trapping ourselves in the dark. I learned that being a flicker isn't a weakness. It's an opportunity. We only have a little bit of time, which means we don't have a second to waste on hate. We have to be the light, even if it's just for a moment, especially if it's just for a moment. I turned back to Xylos, a final thought occurring to me. You know, I never did get that waltz right. I'm pretty sure I still owe you a dance without stepping on your toes. She smiled, a brilliant, genuine expression that made the shadows in the room seem to retreat. I believe the ballroom in the residential wing is open, and there is no one there to analyze the protocol. Then what are we waiting for, I asked. We walked toward the wing, our footsteps echoing in harmony. Behind us, the red dwarf star continued to burn, a steady, ancient heart in the center of a world that was no longer afraid of the dark. I looked at the person walking beside me. Not a queen, not a shadow, just a friend. And I wondered about all the other monsters out there in the galaxy, waiting for someone to stop judging them long enough to ask for a dance. Interactive question. I spent my whole life seeing monsters in every shadow, only to realize that the most dangerous monsters were the ones I'd built out of my own fear and prejudice. It makes me wonder, when you look at someone who is completely different from you, someone whose world you don't understand, what is the first thing you see? Do you see a wall to be guarded, or do you see a bridge waiting to be built? I took Xylos's hand as we reached the empty ballroom, and as the music began to play, a simple human melody, I realized I didn't need to lead anymore. We simply moved together into the light.